I always thought family betrayal was something that happened to other people, not me. My parents told me they couldn't afford to join me on vacation, and I believed them, because why would your own family lie? But at the airport, as I dragged my suitcase toward economy, I froze. My sister's kids were laughing in first class, sipping juice, their seats paid for by the same parents who claimed to be broke. I stayed silent, but inside, something broke. That silence wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of a plan I'd carry to the very end. From the outside, the Andersons looked like the perfect American family. Their suburban home stood proudly behind a white picket fence, the garden blooming with tulips and roses in spring, a flag fluttering on the porch. Neighbors envied their Sunday barbecues, the framed photographs of smiling faces hanging neatly in the living room, the kind of domestic bliss people thought only existed in commercials. But perfection, as Claire had learned, was a costume. At 35, she still found herself reaching for crumbs of approval from her parents. Every achievement, every sacrifice, she laid at their feet, hoping for the warmth of pride. Yet their gaze always lingered elsewhere, on Daniel, her older brother, their golden child. He was the son who could do no wrong, the one whose smallest victories were celebrated with champagne, while Claire's milestones dissolved into silence. She tried to hide the ache. In family photos, her smile never faltered. The camera captured her laughter, the way she leaned into her mother, the way her father's arm draped around Daniel. But behind that practiced grin, her fingers often curled tightly around a leather-bound journal. Inside its pages, she recorded every slight, every dismissal, every moment when the illusion cracked. And one evening, as the flashbulb went off and her parents cheered for Daniel's promotion, Claire's thumb grazed a torn corner of paper. A secret she hadn't meant to create, but one that whispered to her, nothing in this house was as perfect as it seemed. She told herself it didn't matter, that families were complicated, that she was overthinking. Yet the weight of their favoritism pressed harder with every year. Daniel's trophies lined the mantel. His face appeared on every holiday card. His laughter filled every room. Hers, meanwhile, faded like wallpaper. Always present, never noticed. The first real crack appeared on Daniel's birthday. The living room brimmed with relatives, balloons sagging against the ceiling, cake crumbs scattered across paper plates. Claire hovered near the kitchen, half listening to the chatter, when she heard her parents speaking in low tones just a few feet away. "If it weren't for Claire," her mother muttered, her voice sharp with frustration, "everything would be easier." Her father sighed. "I know, she just complicates things." Claire froze, her plastic cup of soda trembling in her hand. For a moment, she wondered if she had misheard. But their faces, tired and resigned, told her otherwise. They hadn't meant to be cruel. They had simply spoken the truth they carried so comfortably. She plastered on a smile when they turned, pretending she hadn't heard a thing. She toasted Daniel's health, laughed at his jokes, and clapped when he unwrapped expensive gifts. No one saw the way her hands shook. No one noticed how she slipped quietly out of the party before it ended. That night, she sat at her desk, the only lamp in her apartment casting a pale glow over the pages of her journal. She wrote until her hand ached. "They never wanted me," she scribbled. "Not really. I was an accident they never forgave. I am the shadow in their perfect picture, the mistake that ruined their story." Tears stained the ink, smearing the words. She pressed the pen harder, as if carving the truth into the paper would make it undeniable. When her sobs subsided, she slid the journal under her pillow, a secret tucked close to her skin. She thought it would stay there forever, hidden from everyone else, a silent witness to her pain. What she didn't know was that the same book would one day crawl out of hiding, that its pages would resurface, torn edges and all, transformed from the refuge of her grief into a weapon sharp enough to shatter the Anderson family's golden cage. The cracks that had once been subtle widened until they became impossible to ignore. It began during a Sunday dinner when relatives gathered around the polished oak table. Claire had spent hours cooking, setting the table, arranging the flowers her mother liked. She hoped, foolishly, for acknowledgement. But as the plates were passed and wine glasses refilled, Her father turned to her with a smile that wasn't kind. "You never manage to do anything right, do you?" he said, his voice light enough to sound like a joke. But the silence that followed revealed its weight. A few cousins shifted uncomfortably. Her mother laughed, adding, "Oh, don't take him so seriously, Claire. You're too sensitive." Heat rose in her chest. "I worked hard on this meal," she said quietly, trying to steady her voice. Her mother waved her hand, dismissive. "You imagine insults where there are none. Stop being dramatic." Gaslighting, clean and sharp. Claire felt the walls tilt around her. She knew what she had heard. She knew the sting of it. And yet, as always, their denial left her questioning her own memory. That night, as she sat in her bedroom, the echo of their words clung to her. For a moment she closed her eyes, drifting back to a childhood memory. The lull of her mother's voice singing softly in the dark, tucking the blanket beneath her chin. She had believed then, with the certainty of a child, that she was loved. That memory returned now like a cruel trick, a reminder that even sweetness could become poison once the truth seeped in. The next blow came quietly but cut deeper than any insult. While helping Daniel organize papers in their father's office, Claire's eyes caught a folder stamped with bold letters, "Inheritance Planning." She flipped through it when no one was watching, her heart hammering against her ribs. Page after page outlined her parents' assets, the house, the land, the savings accounts. Every line of the will bore Daniel's name. Her own name never appeared, not once. She froze, the paper trembling in her hands. Years of sacrifice, of loyalty, of silence, and she was invisible on the one document that mattered most. She slipped the folder back into place before anyone noticed, but the truth lodged in her chest like a shard of glass. Their golden cage wasn't just a prison. It was designed to erase her entirely. She scribbled furiously in her journal that night, the words nearly tearing through the page. "They plan to leave me nothing, not even acknowledgement. I am a ghost in their eyes." The micro cliffhanger pressed itself into her mind. If they had already written her out of the future, then what did her present even mean? In the weeks that followed, the poison spread deeper. Claire became the family scapegoat. When Daniel's business deal faltered, her father muttered that Claire had brought bad luck. When her mother forgot an appointment, she blamed Claire for distracting her with complaints. Even distant relatives picked up the script, teasing her about being the difficult one. She learned to carry the blame silently, her jaw tight, her hands folded in her lap. Yet every wound left a mark in her journal, page after page, building into a silent archive of cruelty. Daniel, for his part, never defended her. He sat quietly through each accusation, his expression unreadable. But sometimes, when no one else was looking, his eyes flickered with something softer. Guilt, maybe, or shame. It wasn't enough to undo the years of favoritism, but it planted a question in Claire's mind. Was he truly her enemy, or just another prisoner, gilded rather than chained? Still, silence was complicity. On a rainy evening, Claire returned home after another dinner where her parents had reduced her to a punchline. She opened her journal, ink bleeding across the page. If I disappeared tomorrow, would they notice? Or would life be easier for them, just as they said? The thought chilled her. Not because it wasn't true, but because it might be. And so the venom spread, not only through her family's words, but into her very sense of self, eroding the belief that she mattered. What she didn't yet realize was that the same venom would one day turn into fire. The breaking point came during what should have been an ordinary dinner. The air was already thick with tension, the kind that made every bite of food taste bitter. Claire sat quietly, trying not to draw attention, when her father set down his fork and looked directly at her. "We regret having you," he said flatly, his voice steady as though delivering a fact rather than a wound. Her mother didn't flinch. She simply nodded, adding softly, "You've made everything harder for this family." The words sliced through her like glass. For a moment, Claire couldn't breathe. She had been insulted, dismissed, ignored before. But this was different. This was the death of illusion. She realized with a sickening clarity that the little girl who once believed she was loved had been wrong all along. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the floor, and walked upstairs. Her parents didn't follow. They didn't ask where she was going. In her room, Claire moved mechanically, folding clothes, stacking them in a suitcase. She grabbed essentials, the bare minimum she would need to disappear. Her hands shook as she packed, not from indecision, but from the cold numbness spreading through her chest. Before leaving, she pulled open her desk drawer to check the journal that had absorbed her pain for years. She flipped through its pages one last time, her handwriting frantic, her words a testament to the invisible wounds she carried. Then, without meaning to, she left it there, tucked inside the drawer, forgotten in her rush. Or perhaps not forgotten at all. Perhaps it was destiny that the book would one day surface, not as a diary of suffering, but as a weapon of truth. Claire shut the drawer and walked out, suitcase in hand. She didn't say goodbye. The door closed behind her, sealing off the only home she had ever known. The days that followed blurred together. Claire rented a small apartment in the city, a place where peeling wallpaper and flickering lights mirrored her unraveling state. She quit her job without explanation, unable to face the weight of everyday life. Bills piled up. Her phone rang with messages she didn't answer. The silence grew unbearable. She fell into a darkness deeper than she had ever known. Sleep eluded her. Food lost its taste. The walls seemed to close in tighter every night, as though conspiring to crush her. The journal she once wrote in was gone, left behind in the very house that had destroyed her. Without it, she had no outlet, no voice. One evening, she lit a candle in the center of her small kitchen table. The flame flickered, casting shadows that danced across the cracked ceiling. She watched it for hours, hypnotized. Her thoughts twisted around a single question. If this is the last light I see, would it matter? Would anyone notice? Her lips parted and she whispered into the empty room. If this is the last light of my life, so be it. The words startled her, echoing louder than she intended. She pressed her hand to her chest, trembling. She didn't want to die, but she didn't know how to live like this anymore. The candle burned lower. The silence pressed tighter. She curled into herself on the couch, staring at the dying flame, her mind skimming the edge of surrender. And then the phone rang. The sound shattered the stillness, sharp and insistent. She glanced at the screen. Daniel's name glowed back at her. Her hand hovered over the phone, heart pounding. For years he had been silent, complicit. Why was he calling now? She didn't answer. She let it ring, the sound drilling into her chest. Her breath quickened, her eyes wet. She closed her eyes until the ringing stopped, leaving only silence and the faint flicker of the candle. The flame wavered as if uncertain, just like her. Somewhere inside, she felt the faintest tremor of possibility that the story wasn't finished yet. The discovery was an accident, or at least that's how the story would later be told. While rummaging through drawers in Claire's old room, her mother's hands brushed against the spine of the worn leather journal. She pulled it out, expecting perhaps old letters or forgotten receipts. Instead, she opened the first page and froze. The words bled across the paper like open wounds. All I ever wanted was to be loved. Her mother's lips pressed thin. She flipped through more pages, each one a dagger. Every dismissal, every insult, every secret shame Claire had poured into those lines was now exposed. The book that had been her sanctuary was transformed into evidence, a mirror no one in the Anderson household wanted to face. But it wasn't only pain written there. Tucked between the pages was something else, a printed copy of an email, addressed from her father to a lawyer. Its subject line read, "Estate planning." The message was blunt. Claire was to be excluded from the will. Daniel alone would inherit everything. The paper fell from her mother's hands. Silence roared through the house. Daniel happened to walk in at that moment. He bent down, picked up the printout, and read, his face drained of color. For the first time, he saw the truth written in black and white, not just the cruelty of his parents, but his own role in it. The golden pedestal he had stood on for so long was built from his sister's suffering. He sank into a chair, the journal open in his lap. Words swirled before his eyes. They wish I had never been born. They see me as a burden. I am nothing but their mistake. His throat tightened. He whispered, barely audible, Claire, you knew? You knew all of this? The question wasn't for his parents. It was for himself, and for the ghost of his sister's pain echoing through the ink. Across the city, Claire was carving her own path out of the ashes. She had begun therapy, hesitant at first, unsure if she even deserved help. But her therapist's words cut through the fog. What you experienced wasn't normal. It was abuse. You are allowed to walk away. Those sessions became lifelines. Piece by piece, she dismantled the belief that she was broken. She began to understand the term toxic family, not as a vague label, but as a map of her own life. The guilt that had chained her loosened with every week she sat in that chair. She started to plan, not for survival, but for rebirth. A new job first. Modest, but hers alone, untainted by family ties. Then, carefully, she reached out to new friends, people who valued her without conditions. For the first time, she felt the possibility of connection that wasn't poisoned by obligation. But the most radical step came late one night when she opened her laptop and began to type. She wrote not in her journal, but in a blog she created under a pseudonym. She poured her story into the screen. The favoritism, the gaslighting, the betrayal written into inheritance papers. She didn't name names, but her voice was raw, unflinching. She clicked publish, her heart pounding. Days later, the post had spread farther than she ever imagined. Thousands of strangers had read her words. Comments flooded in. This is my life. You just wrote what I've never been able to say. Thank you for speaking out. Claire sat in the glow of the screen, tears running silently down her face. She wasn't invisible anymore. Her pain had touched others, turned strangers into allies. For the first time, she felt the power of her own voice. She leaned back in her chair, whispering to herself, maybe I wasn't wrong. Maybe I wasn't nothing. The weight lifted just a little, but the story wasn't finished. Because one night, as the blog continued to spread, a familiar name appeared in the comments section, Daniel. He hadn't signed it, but she knew. His words were tentative, almost pleading. I think I know you. If you are who I believe, I'm sorry. I should have seen it sooner. Claire's breath caught. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. The brother who had stood silent all her life had finally spoken, and for the first time the golden child had cracked. They arrived unannounced, their knocks echoing against Claire's apartment door. When she opened it, her parents stood there, eyes swollen, clutching something familiar in trembling hands. The leather-bound journal, the one she had left behind. Her mother's voice cracked as she held it out. We shouldn't have read it, but we did. We didn't know you felt this way. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her father standing stiff beside her, his jaw clenched but his eyes red. Claire took the book without speaking. For a moment, silence stretched, heavy with years of unspoken words. Then she walked to her desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out loose pages she had never shown anyone. She handed them over, her hands steady. Read these, she said, her voice quiet but sharp as glass. Her father unfolded the first page. The words scrawled in ink were raw, jagged. Today I thought about ending it, and when I did, I heard your voices. It was your words that pushed me to the edge. Her mother covered her mouth, gasping. Her father's shoulders slumped as the weight of the words pressed down. You wanted me erased, Claire continued, her eyes locked on them. But I was already erasing myself, piece by piece, because of you. The room went still. Then Daniel stepped forward. He had followed them quietly, uncertain until now. But as he looked at his sister, something in him shifted. He turned to their parents, his voice rising with a force Claire had never heard. "She's telling the truth," he said. "I've seen the papers. I read the emails. You cut her out and you laughed while she broke." His voice cracked, but he pressed on. "You made me the golden son at the cost of destroying her, and I won't stay silent anymore." The confession ripped through the air. Their parents' perfect facade crumbled in an instant. Claire felt her chest tighten, not with pain, but with something like release. For the first time, Daniel had stood beside her. Before anyone could speak, a knock came at the door. A courier handed Claire a sealed envelope. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter from a lawyer, different from the one her parents had used. The words struck like thunder. She had been granted new legal rights regarding the estate, her exclusion under review due to evidence of manipulation and fraud. Her parents no longer held the absolute power they thought they had. She stared at the letter, stunned. Justice was no longer a dream scribbled in her journal. It was real, written in ink and law. But the reckoning had only begun. News spread quickly. The neighbors who once admired the Andersons' picture-perfect image now whispered openly about betrayal and cruelty. The family that had worn smiles like armor was stripped bare, their reputation shattered. Her parents turned on each other. In front of relatives, in front of Daniel, even in front of Claire, they hurled accusations like stones. "It was your idea to cut her out," her mother spat. "You told me she was a mistake," her father roared back. "You hated her from the start. Don't you dare blame me." The poison they had fed Claire for decades now spilled between them, consuming everything. Daniel stood apart, watching with disgust. "If you can't admit what you did," he said finally, his voice low but deadly serious, "then I'm done. I will not be your son if this is who you choose to be." The words hung in the air like a blade. Their parents froze, as if only now realizing they were about to lose both children, the golden one and the forgotten one. Claire, standing near the doorway, listened as their voices rose again into chaos. She didn't step in. She didn't argue. She simply leaned against the frame, the weight of years slipping off her shoulders. For the first time, it wasn't her voice being drowned out. It was theirs. As their shouts rattled the walls, she closed her eyes, took a steady breath, and whispered to herself, "This is the first time they've tasted the pain I lived with every day." And she knew, with a certainty sharper than any blade, that the reckoning had finally come full circle. Claire never went back to the gilded cage she had once called home. The white fence, the polished photographs, the garden that seemed to bloom only for Daniel. None of it belonged to her anymore, and she no longer wanted it to. She kept her distance, answering only when necessary, brief and polite, as if they were strangers bound by a faint thread of blood. Her energy was no longer wasted on trying to fit inside their narrative. Instead, she poured it into her work and into the community that had begun to form around her anonymous blog. What had started as a single desperate confession had turned into a gathering place for people who carried the same invisible wounds. Survivors of toxic families wrote to her daily, sharing their own scars, thanking her for putting words to the pain they had never dared to speak aloud. One evening, she sat at her desk, sifting through the dozens of emails that arrived each day. Most were short, but one made her pause. It read, "Because of your story, I chose not to end my life. You saved me." She leaned back in her chair, tears filling her eyes. But this time, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of recognition, of purpose. Her suffering had not been wasted. It had been transmuted into something that reached across invisible wires and screens to hold another person's hand in the dark. She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need to be photographed or approved. It was hers alone. And then, one morning, an envelope slid through her mail slot. The handwriting was familiar, hesitant, but firm. She unfolded the letter and read the first line. "Claire, are you willing to build a new family? With me?" It was from Daniel. Her breath caught. For years, he had been the silent witness, the unwilling accomplice. Now, perhaps, he was seeking redemption. She folded the letter carefully, her heart uncertain, her mind racing. Family had once been her prison. Could it ever be something else? She didn't answer right away. But the possibility lingered, a fragile light breaking through the cracks. In the meantime, Claire began a new journal. Its cover was plain, its pages crisp and unmarked. On the first page, she wrote, "I have given birth to myself, this time, in freedom." She filled it not with grief, but with plans, dreams, victories both small and large. It became less a record of pain and more a blueprint for a life she was finally free to claim. Months later, an invitation arrived from a local arts collective. They had heard about her blog, about her story, and wanted to include her journal in an exhibition titled Healing Stories. At first, she hesitated. The old journal was a vessel of blood and tears, her most vulnerable self etched in ink. But when she finally stood in the gallery, looking at it displayed beneath glass, she felt no fear. Visitors leaned in, reading the torn pages, whispering. Some wept. Others nodded in recognition. Her suffering had transcended into testimony. The journal that once chained her was now proof of survival, a mirror for others who needed to see that escape was possible. As the exhibition closed, Claire walked outside into the sunlight. The world felt sharper, brighter, not because it had changed, but because she had. She carried no apologies, no chains. She carried only herself, reborn, whole, and untethered. She paused, turned her face toward the horizon, and whispered the truth she had carved from years of silence. I am not who they said I was. I am who I chose to become. Then she looked forward, directly into the invisible eyes of the world beyond her story. And you, she said softly, as if addressing a stranger, a friend, or anyone who carried the same scars. If your family abandons you, do you have the courage to be born again? The question hung in the air, unanswered, waiting.